Hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture in the PhenoRob Interdisciplinary Lecture Series, or PILS. My name is Marija, I'm a junior research group leader in PhenoRob, and today's lecture will be about uncertainty in deep learning. Deep learning is increasingly used in many applications, from remote sensing to plant phenotyping, medicine, autonomous driving, and economics. However, in many of these applications, it is critical to understand how much can we trust our models, or what confidence do we have in the predictions that they're making. Can we design algorithms that tell us that the model is likely to have generated an error? These are the questions that we try to answer in today's lecture. Now, before we proceed, it is very helpful for today's material if you already have some basic understanding of neural networks and how they work. And thus I highly recommend to watch Professor Stackman's lecture on this topic. Today, we're going to try to build on these concepts so that by the end we can answer the questions: what is uncertainty, what are some basic methods for measuring it, and why it is important. So let's start with this last question. Why should we care about uncertainty? Well, consider a simple example. Say we have a network for image classification and we trained it by showing many examples to distinguish between images of cats and images of dogs. If we were to show this network now what is clearly an image of a cat, we would expect that if the training was done correctly, we would obtain a very high probability of this image being in fact a cat, so a correct classification. However, consider the already same trained network now, but this time we show it an image of a zebra instead. What would happen? What would we expect the network output to be in this case? Well, as humans, we might think that the network would produce something like a 50-50 probability of this being a cat or dog, because there are no clear characteristics of either class in this image. However, in practice, this does not actually happen. Because the network hasn't seen this data before, it will produce uncontrollable behavior and an essentially unpredictable output. And thus, if we don't have a confidence measure telling us that the network is not certain in its prediction, this could lead to misclassification and misinterpretation. Now, this was just a simple example, but the same ideas apply to many real-world applications which are more serious. So consider self-driving cars. In autonomous driving, deep learning models are used quite often for different tasks. For example, we use deep learning for object detection to identify instances of different objects in an image, such as signs, pedestrians, or other cars. We also use deep learning in what we call semantic segmentation. So in an image, we try to assign the probability of each pixel belonging to a particular class, such as being the sidewalk, the road, or another car. In this way, we can interpret what's actually in the scene. However, in any of these tasks, if the networks make a mistake, this can lead to potential disasters. For example, if the network does not succeed in detecting another car and says it's safe to navigate there, this could result in a very serious accident. But if we had the method of extracting the confidence measure from this prediction, and if the network was able to tell us that it's uncertain, we could then pass the control to a human driver, for example, and successfully avert this disaster. Another application where the same ideas apply is in medical diagnosis. So these days there's a lot of work done on automated medical diagnosis using deep learning models. So here we see an example where we have X-ray images and we train the model to distinguish between healthy lungs and lungs infected with COVID-19 disease. And in practice, we would use this information to supplement the medical record of a patient, such that a clinical practitioner could look at it and use it to prescribe treatment or instruct what to do next. However, we can already see by looking at these images that there are some variations in what the lungs of different patients actually look like. And therefore, we might encounter situations where the network is not certain in the predictions that it is making. So it might not be able to detect a disease if it is present or misinform us. And a confidence measure would be useful in this case because we could refer that particular image to a medical expert to inspect it more closely, as opposed to the network just guessing at random and us taking those predictions at face value. However, apart from these safety critical and sensitive applications, there are also other scenarios where uncertainty could be useful. One of those is called active learning, which we just introduced briefly here and then come back to later in the lecture when we understand more. So as we have already seen, for supervised learning to take place in deep learning models, we need essentially two things. We need a training set consisted of the data that we want to learn from and its labels or its annotations. And we also need a learning model or an algorithm that we try to optimize so that it can fit this data correctly. But the question is, how do we generate this labeled training set that we use for learning? So these examples that we show our model. How is this done in practice? Well, usually we have a human in the loop that needs to annotate all of these images. So in the cat and dog classification example, a human would actually sit down and determine which images belong to each class, or in medical applications, count the number of cells that are present in an X-ray image or similar. So as we might imagine, this step is rather laborious and time-consuming. So in active learning, what we try to do is essentially inform the human which images need to be annotated, which are the most useful to annotate, so that we can reduce the total number of images that the human needs to label and conserve resources and labeling effort that would otherwise be present if we were to just annotate all the images that we have. Now that we're convinced that uncertainty is very important for many applications, let's think more closely as to what uncertainty actually is and how we can represent it. In deep learning, there are two main types of uncertainty, and understanding the differences between them is important, as well as the relevance to different applications. The first type of uncertainty that we have is called Eleatoric Uncertainty or data uncertainty. This uncertainty is inherent to the input data and the process that generated it. So it's all about the randomness, about the circumstances in which we created the data. To make it this more concrete, here are some examples from different computer vision applications. Eleatoric uncertainty is present, for example, when we have noisy or grainy images, which we often see, as well as when there is a motion blur caused by moving objects in an image relative to the camera exposure. Note that this type of uncertainty is caused by the quality of the camera, so that even when we add more images, we do not reduce the eleatoric uncertainty. This is only possible when we improve the quality of the precision of the sensor used to capture the input data. Further, we can subdivide eleatoric uncertainty into two different categories: homoscedastic uncertainty and heteroscedastic uncertainty. And on this slide, we explain the differences between them using a simple regression example. So here we have some black data points that we captured using a sensor, and then we fitted a blue curve of best fit through them. And in the blue envelope, we can see the uncertainty that is obtained using our regression model using two different approaches. So when we have a homoscedastic regression model, we can see that the envelope of the uncertainty around this curve of best fit is essentially equal because there is equal width. So this uncertainty is the same everywhere, and it is only a function of the input data. In contrast, in the heteroscedastic case, we can see a different width depending on the input data. So this is variant to the input data, unlike homoscedastic uncertainty. And therefore, when we have a high variability in data points, we have a wider envelope, indicating that in this case, our regression model can actually capture high uncertainty in this particular portion of the input space. And that's eleatoric uncertainty. The second uncertainty in deep learning is called epistemic uncertainty or model uncertainty. this uncertainty is caused by a lack of knowledge in the input data. So sometimes our training data does not capture the training domain completely, and that is, in these locations, we have a high epistemic uncertainty. We can also try to explain this using an example, and we see some more visualizations later. So consider this neural network architecture used for semantic image segmentation. This architecture is called SegNet. So in the input, we have a color image that we want to segment, and the segmentation output essentially assign a probability of each pixel in an image belonging to a particular class. And that is what we see visualized here in the colors. For example, in the yellow, we have vegetation, the purple are the vehicles on the road, and the pink is the road itself. So a successful segmentation output would be able to capture all these different semantics, all these different features in the color image. Now let's say we have this model and we trained it using data by showing many examples from one city, a road imagery acquired in one city. If we showed images from the same city, we would expect the network to perform very well. But if we could then collect data in another city, where the trees might look slightly different or the road have different features that are not present in the first city, the model may not perform as well. And in this case, the model would have a high epistemic uncertainty, because essentially there is a discrepancy between the data that we trained the network on and that it learned and the data that we presented. We'll see some more visualizations of this in the next slide. Now, to understand the differences between eleatoric and epistemic uncertainty, we can also look at this against simple regression example. On the green dashed line, we see a function that we're trying to learn, and the blue points are essentially some data that we collected using a sensor at two different locations along the x-axis. So if we look at the data here on the left, we can see a high variability in the vertical direction of the data samples that we collected. And therefore, if we were even to collect more samples using the same sensor, the points would likely fall somewhere in this cloud and be just as spread. So then we can say that this part of the input space has a high variability and a high eleatoric uncertainty. In contrast, on the right side, the blue data points are rather compact and close to the real function. So our sensor is rather precise. And this, we can say, has low eleatoric uncertainty. As regards to epistemic uncertainty, we notice that there are some parts of the input space that are simply not covered. So we either have little or no data points in three different parts along the x-axis. So in these regions, we have a high epistemic uncertainty because there are many different model parameters that can explain this phenomenon. And if we were to add more data points here, we would be able to reduce or explain away the epistemic uncertainty because the model has more information to learn from. Now, going back to our example of image segmentation using the SegNet architecture, we can also visualize what the eleatoric and the epistemic uncertainty actually look like and compare them. So in the left column, we see an input color image that we pass to the segmentation network. In the second column is the ground truth, or perfect annotation that could be, for example, generated by the human, labeling all the pixels in an image, given a set of classes. The next column is the semantic segmentation output that is the result of our prediction. And essentially, we want this to be as close as possible to the ground truth. And finally, interestingly, in the right columns, we visualize eleatoric uncertainty and epistemic uncertainty on a pixel level. So here we have some redder areas, which correspond to areas of high uncertainty, and blue means low uncertainty. So if we compare these two columns, we can see that we actually get high eleatoric uncertainty around occlusions, where there are depth discontinuities reflecting the fact that labels in these areas might be imperfect. So this exhibits high eleatoric uncertainty, which is a function of the input data, as we just explained. In contrast, we see high epistemic uncertainty, for example, along this irregular footpath that was likely not present in the training data, meaning that the model has not seen this characteristic before, and epistemic uncertainty essentially tells us this. Now, in this lecture, we're going to mostly focus on the epistemic uncertainty or the model uncertainty that is a function of this training data. So now the natural question is, how do we actually generate these images of eleatoric and epistemic uncertainty? What techniques can we use to do that? Well, to understand this, we're going to recap briefly what neural networks are and their key elements so that we can understand how to extract uncertainty in some more technical detail. Now, here we see a simple feed-forward neural network called a multi-layer perceptron. This neural network is nothing but a composition of functions with different parameters inside it. So we have an input layer which receives the input data from the outside world and processes it to generate some features. Then we have an arbitrary number of hidden layers within the networks. These layers are essentially a chain of operations where each hidden layer accepts the data from the previous layer and performs some mathematical operation. Eventually, we reach the output layer, which takes the output from the last hidden layer and converts it to something that we can use in the real world. For example, the probability of a pixel belonging to a particular class. This neural network has two key elements within it. So we have the neuron, so these are these circles, which are essentially a function. So the neuron accepts different inputs, performs some function called an activation function, and outputs something to the next neuron. And the second element is called a synapse, which is essentially the link between different neurons in the neural network. Each synapse is associated with a weight, which tells us how much the output coming from the previous neuron is influencing the next one. So if we have a low weight, that means we have a low influence of this value on the next function, and if we have a high weight, it's the opposite. And basically, when we train a neural network, we show it different examples, and we try to optimize nudge the values of these weights in the direction so that it best fits our training data and its labels. This is what we call to train a neural network. Now, how does this relate to our previous example of image segmentation? Well, now we can understand what these blocks in the neural network architecture actually mean. So we have different colored blocks which correspond to different operations moving between the input to the output. And each of these blocks or layers contains different neurons and synapses whose weights we try to optimize when we show the network the training data. Training the network essentially amounts to figuring out the numerical values for these weights which best fit the data. So with a trained network, we can therefore produce some segmentation examples, such as the ones we see here. So there are some input images that we pass through a trained network and different segmentation examples where, again, the different colors correspond to different classes as to what we want to detect in these images. And we can already see, if we look closely, that the network performs rather well and produces these crispy outlines when the scene is very simple. However, in more cluttered environments, when there are lots of cars and traffic and pedestrians, we see rather discontinuities leading to errorless predictions. And these are some examples that further motivate extracting the uncertainty so that the network can tell us that it's actually less confident in more cluttered scenes. So in order to capture this uncertainty, relating back to our standard neural network, we need to extend it into what we call a Bayesian neural network. And as we might be familiar from other disciplines, the word Bayesian here simply refers to the fact that we're using statistical methods to understand what's going on and working in the space of probability distributions. So basically, what we do in a Bayesian neural network is we want to put a probability distribution over its weights or over its parameters, which captures their uncertainty. So in a standard neural network, we had different weights, which by training, we tried to figure out what the best numerical values are. However, in a Bayesian neural network, we now have distributions over the weights. So the weights can actually take on a range of values. And we can look at the spread of these distributions to figure out how much uncertainty we have in each individual weight or each individual connection between the neurons. So when we have a high spread, that would indicate a high uncertainty in the distribution because the value of that weight can take on a large range of values. Now, this is easy to understand intuitively as well as to formulate. However, actually training Bayesian neural networks and performing predictions in them is much more difficult. We typically have a large amount of high-dimensional data that we want to train on, as well as a large number of parameters or weights in our network. And furthermore, in this setup, unfortunately, we cannot formulate analytic solutions to figure out the best distributions over the weights. So we can't formulate mathematical equations and simply solve them to figure out the best weight distributions that fit our data. And therefore, typically what we do to estimate uncertainty in Bayesian neural networks is resort to approximate methods to extract particularly the model uncertainty or the epistemic uncertainty. In this way, we avoid complex reasoning and increase the efficiency of performing inference in our Bayesian neural networks. In this lecture, we cover two different methods for model uncertainty estimation using approximate techniques from an intuitive point of view. The first method we cover is based on a technique called dropout. As the name suggests, what we do in Dropout is essentially randomly switch off neurons in a network to create different subsets of its architecture. For example, if we have a standard neural network with two hidden layers that is fully connected, applying Dropout, we would randomly eliminate some of these neurons shown by the crosses and their ingoing and outgoing connections. This creates a sparser or a thinned out version of the network architecture, where the dropped out neurons don't participate in the data flow anymore. The way that we do this in practice is we typically have a dropout probability associated with switching off each neuron. How does this relate to uncertainty estimation? Dropout is the core idea behind a model uncertainty estimation technique called Monte Carlo dropout. What we do using this method is we have a network and we create different dropout configurations with different neurons, shown here in the white, being switched off. So each version of the network applies different dropout configurations so that we have different data flows happening. Then, when we have one single input, in this case x, we can pass it through the network to see what the output would be. Then we can collect the outputs from each of these different dropout configurations and analyze them. So over here, each pink circle corresponds to an output obtained from a different dropout configuration. Then, given these outputs, we can fit a probability distribution through them to see what is the variability of the outputs of the different model configurations. So for example, for these outputs, we could fit a Gaussian distribution, and we could look at the variance of that Gaussian that tells us something about the variability or the uncertainty of the different outputs of the models. Let's apply this more concretely now to our previous example of image segmentation. Before, we saw SegNet, which is an architecture for the semantic segmentation of color images. On this slide, we can see what SegNet looks like when we apply Dropout. So we have an input, and then in each of these blocks, we can apply Dropout to randomly switch off neurons and change the data flow within the network. So for an input, we can apply Dropout and collect a single output. We do this many times, creating different Dropout configurations, so that we collect stochastic Dropout samples, each of which is slightly different. And then if we fit a Gaussian, we could figure out the mean of this predictions to correspond to our most likely segmentation. But we can also study the variance, which corresponds to the model uncertainty. What differences do we see in the pixels of that image when we have different dropout versions of our network? So for example, we can see low uncertainty or whiter areas here, where the model had a lot of data to learn from, and the dropout versions all agree with each other because they learned this type of input. However, we can see high uncertainty in some areas here, for example, the sky, when there is a lack of data and we cannot control the network's behavior, resulting in low predictability and high variability, thus high model uncertainty. So that's one method of extracting model uncertainty from a network. The second technique we cover is called ensembling. And using ensembling, instead of having one single network, we essentially train multiple different neural networks and compare their outputs. So instead of passing one input through the same network many times, we now have different networks. And that's what we see in the schematic here. So we have a set of input data, and then we have different networks, and we can combine their predictions in a similar way to Monte Carlo dropout to figure out the variability in predictions. On this slide, we can see examples of ensembling in action for different computer vision tasks. So on the top two rows show the task of depth completion, which is where we basically try to assign a depth value for each pixel in an image. And on the bottom, we see semantic segmentation, which is pixel-wise class probabilities, just like we saw in the previous slides. So on the left shows the input image for each of these tasks. In the middle row is the prediction that we obtain from the network. And on the third column, we see the predictive uncertainty. This uncertainty was obtained using 8 different ensemble methods. So we had the same input, we passed it through 8 different networks, and then we computed the variance of their outputs. And in a similar way to Monte Carlo dropout, we can see when the models disagree with each other, and we have high uncertainty, indicating high variability and lack of training data, because it is in these areas that we need to create additional training data so that the model learns to reduce the predictive uncertainty. So those are 2 techniques for model uncertainty estimation using approximate methods, Monte Carlo dropout, and deep ensembles. Now we want to go back to the beginning of the lecture and look at one application where these types of uncertainty measures could actually be very useful. And we'll focus on the application of active learning. So in conventional supervised deep learning is also known as passive learning. So what we do here, as we saw in most of the examples in this lecture, we have a large pool of raw unlabeled data. For example, images collected with a drone or a self-driving car, or simply images taken from the internet. Then we have a human annotator, which has to sit down and label or classify all of these images based on something that we want to learn. We have this label data then that we can then pass through our neural network, applied the training procedure to optimize the model weights, the model parameters, resulting in a trained model that we can then deploy. However, the major bottleneck of deep learning is often in this annotation procedure, because labeling and annotating a lot of data so that the model can learn properly can be very expensive and laborious. This is especially the case if we need expert knowledge in the human annotator. For example, somebody who can really understand different plant species or identify a disease they see in the images. We need experts sometimes to perform this expensive annotation step. What active learning tries to do is exploit the model uncertainty to alleviate some of the efforts that lies in this annotation procedure. So in an active learning framework, we still have a set of raw unlabeled data that we want to label so that the network can learn. But this time, rather than passing them to the human directly, we use an active learning module. What the active learner does is it takes some of this raw unlabeled data and it applies an uncertainty estimation technique to figure out how uncertain these images are with respect to the data that we have already labeled. So here we see an example using aerial imagery. We have different aerial images and we tried to apply semantic segmentation, and we also extracted the uncertainty using one of the methods that we saw in the previous slides, Monte Carlo dropout or deep ensembling. So here the lighter areas correspond to higher uncertainty. And the key idea is in active learning is to exploit the fact that these high uncertainty areas actually correspond to places where the model needs more training data. So if we look at the uncertainty images, we might deduce based on some metrics that the third image is the most uncertain one and thus the most useful one that would be beneficial to label so that the network can learn properly. It is only then this image that we would pass to the human annotator so that they can label them. So in this way, we exploit the model uncertainty measure to make an informed decision about which image should be annotated next by the human. The human then passes the images that he or she has labeled back to the active learner, and we can repeat this process multiple times to obtain enough labeled data that we can then use to train the network. And then the training procedure proceeds just as we did before. So the core idea here is that we introduce this new unit to guide the annotation of the images in a smart way based on the model uncertainty extracted using one of the model uncertainty estimation techniques. There are many studies which actually demonstrate the benefit of active learning also quantitatively. So here we show one example based on a popular benchmark dataset in active learning. So the idea is very simple. We have some pictures of digits and we want to classify which digit is in that image. And here are some results that essentially compare the benefits of using active learning against random image selection. So on the y-axis, we see the classification accuracy, so how correctly we were at identifying the digit in an image. And on the bottom, we can see the number of labeled images that we use to train the network. The different color curves here actually correspond to different active learning strategies, and the brown one is a random baseline, where we essentially simply pick random images from that unlabeled pool for labeling and then training the network. All the different colors are an active learning strategy which make use of the model uncertainty. We can see, therefore, a big difference in the random curves and many of the active learning strategies. There is a large gap there, which indicates that with the same number of labeled images, we can actually obtain a much higher classification accuracy. So the human needs to label less images, but improving the model performance. So this is one very practical use case for deep learning uncertainty. And this idea brings us to the end of the lecture. So wrapping things up, today we learned about uncertainty in deep learning, why it's important, and we identified different methods for estimating the uncertainty, including Monte Carlo dropout and deep ensemble methods. These tell us something about the confidence we have in a neural network when it's making its prediction in different tasks. And finally, we looked at one practical use case of uncertainty in deep learning, which was active learning, which enabled us to conserve human labeling effort for training our deep learning models.